This video is made possible by the Eliason Group, an Agile consulting service. You can locate the video under Follow Us, then select Recent Videos on YouTube on the agilenewengland.org website.
Thank you, Shyam, because you're tirelessly serving the New England community, New England Agile community. So it's a great honor to speak here. My name is Ram Srinivasan, and someone told that I should need to have a shameless about me slide so that people can know who I am. I'm a certified Scrum trainer and a practitioner, 100% practitioner. I work at Vistaprint as a Scrum Master. I'm also a contributor to the upcoming one-day large-scale Scrum workshop that's being jointly hosted by Scrum Alliance and the LESS company. Scrum Alliance recently announced that they are partnering with the LESS company in adopting LESS as one of the frameworks for scaling, so we are developing a course on that. I'm also an expert reviewer for the PMI Agile Practice Guide, which is probably going to be released very soon. My passion is in learning about complexity with human systems, particularly neuroscience, as well as I like to use systems thinking when I'm coaching clients. Participated, reviewed, as well as contributed to many other Agile events as well. So you can just look at my slides at SlideShare. They are available. Okay. So whatever I say today, take it with a pinch of salt, because over the past few years, my thinking process has been greatly biased by the guy you see there, Craig Larman. I got to know him about a couple of years ago, and he totally changed my perception of what Agile and what Scrum is. And this picture was taken when Craig and I were actually having a semi-private conversation at the Scrum Gathering in last April about the large-scale Scrum one-day workshop and how the Scrum Alliance is planning to launch it. And Alistair Coburn comes in and says, hey, you should be Craig Larman. And he's like, you should be Alistair. It just happened that they know each other for 25 years, but have never met them. And I was right there. So it's probably like a little bit of a historic moment for me. So whatever I say, take it with a pinch of salt, because what I say may or may not be applicable to you, because I'm pretty biased towards large-scale Scrum, and my thinking process has been a little bit brainwashed by Craig Larman and Baswade. Okay? So the first question is, okay, do we really need to scale? One of the consistent patterns I have seen over the past few years across industry is we are a big organization, okay, we have a huge product, we have multiple locations, we have vendors, so we need a big framework, preferably a pretty big framework for scaling. And that's a story I'm consistently hearing again and again and again and again. And that's probably also, that belief does not question the underlying assumptions of that story, and probably has led to a lot of bad Agile adoptions over the course of the past few years, especially since scaling is gaining traction. So this is what is the most fundamental lesson in scaling. You don't need to scale. Okay, you don't need to scale. Okay. If that was all it, the presentation is over, and probably you can go home. I can go home as well. Okay, and this is what Craig and Bas said: large scale, don't; multi-site, don't; and offshore, don't. Okay, these are authors of Large Scale Scrum. And Martin Fowler said that scaling probably should be the last thing that you should be doing. Jeff Sutherland validated many of these things, the keynote at the Scrum Gathering, by saying about 60-70% of the problems that people are trying to solve with scaling are actually not scaling problems. Okay? So, but there might be an exceptional scenario where maybe you are building an operating system like Windows 10, or building a telecommunication network like LTE network. And at that point in time, probably you cannot do it with one team alone working in one location. So you probably need more teams. And how do you really do that in case that is your last option? So my suggestion is to look at scaling as a rattlesnake. You avoid scaling as much as possible, and that if you deal with the rattlesnake only as a last available option. So you don't really pet a rattlesnake. You don't really say, hey, I like rattlesnakes and all this kind of stuff. So kind of try to see if you can avoid scaling as much as possible. Okay? So having said this, we want to kind of level set the terminologies and the expectations in terms of what is the basic Scrum. So here's a small exercise. We're going to distribute a handout. There are 5 blanks right there. So activity is A, you and your partner You're going to try to fill in the 5 blanks. So all of you are going to stand up. The first activity is fill in the 5 blanks along with your partner. And the second activity is one of you try to explain the Scrum framework to your partner, especially what those arrows mean. And once you're done, you can sit down. So you can standing up so that I know that you're still working and you're still not working, and I know how many people are still working. Let's see how many people can finish this in 2 minutes or less. Okay, most of you are done. Let me kind of run through the Scrum framework very quickly so that we can level set what Scrum is. We have a product owner who owns the product backlog. Product backlog is an artifact. The sprint is a container event for all the events in the Scrum framework. During sprint planning meeting, the product backlog items are pulled in by the Scrum team. Scrum team is Scrum Master, product owner, and the team. During the sprint planning meeting, they pull in product backlog items. They figure out what to do and how to do. They craft the sprint goal. They create the initial sprint backlog, and after that, sprint execution starts. During the sprint execution, the team is having a meeting called Daily Scrum every single day. It's a daily planning meeting where they're inspecting and adapting their progress towards Daily Scrum. It's a planning meeting. It's not a status meeting. At the end of the sprint execution, you have a sprint review. Sprint review is for the product. The product is built as per the current definition of done, such that it is in a shippable state. Stakeholders and Scrum team review the product together. The feedback from the stakeholders goes back into the product backlog. And after sprint review, you have a meeting called sprint retrospective. It's an inspect and adapt meeting for the Scrum team. The product owner is mandatory, and usually the Scrum Master facilitates it, and action items goes back into the sprint backlog. Okay, 3 artifacts in Scrum: product backlog owned by the product owner, sprint backlog owned by the team or the development team or the product development team, and increment or product increment or potentially shippable product increment. You got 3 roles: product owner, Scrum Master, and team. And you got 4 meetings plus 1 activity: sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, retrospective, plus product backlog refinement, consuming no more than 10% of the available time. And it's an activity. Scrum does not describe how it should be done. And the main purpose of product backlog refinement is to get the product backlog ready for the upcoming 1 to 2 sprints. Any questions about basic Scrum?
Express one.
Yeah. Yeah, Gloria.
Are you aware of how fast you are spot?
Yes. My goal is to actually, Shyam told me I should not be taking more than 2 minutes to cover basic Scrum. I just wanted to make sure I'm following his guidelines. Okay. Shyam. You can blame it on Shyam. Okay. It actually kind of is good to get a little bit of history about large-scale Scrum. Large-scale Scrum started in about 2005 when Craig Larman started experimenting with scaling Scrum. And the first book was written in 2008, Scaling Lean and Agile Development. And he gave a lot of principles of how to scale Scrum, queuing theory, systems thinking, all this kind of stuff. And people kind of did not really know how to apply those principles because they are not very pragmatic. They're all principles. And then said, okay, fine, people are looking for practices. And then they wrote the second book, which is Practices for Scaling Lean and Agile Development. And they gave a lot of practices. And people started cherry picking the practices. Oh, we can do this. Oh, we need not do this. And the pattern adopted, the patterns were actually the adoption started failing. And they came up with the third book, which serves more as a gate book at this point in time. And if you were to pick any of these 3 books, I would recommend that you pick the third book called Large Scale Scrum, which was released in 2016, last summer. That probably is a very good book, which tells you what are some of the things that are mutable, what are some of the things that are non-mutable. Just like Scrum, Large Scale Scrum is a framework. The challenge with applying a framework in a complex adaptive system is that when you get too prescriptive, practices don't scale. Some of the practices are not very relevant. And if you just give principles, it's hard for novices to understand what practices to embrace and what practices to discard. Okay? Large-scale Scrum kind of hits the sweet spot between abstract principles and concrete practices by giving you a few rules which are not mutable and giving you a bunch of guidelines which says, hey, this has worked for many people. This may also work for you. And then about 600 experiments and says, no, it worked for someone, it may not work for you, but try it out, and here is what other people have tried it out. And there are no false dichotomies, meaning like there is no absolute true or false. And it all depends on the context under which we operate. I would like to view large-scale Scrum as a framework or a meta-process framework for organizational design. I mean, if you really think about Scrum even as a framework for organizational design, it starts surfacing all the impediments and stuff like that. And the challenge with large-scale Scrum is that it's going to start exposing many of the defects and waste that are existing in the organization in a very painful way. You might be able to do Scrum without changing your organization design, and you may be able to claim that, yes, we are doing Scrum, and you can get away with that. And unfortunately, that's not going to be true with large-scale Scrum. Okay, we look at hierarchies, we look at structures, policies, how is the organization designed, what might be some of the not so useful elements in organization. Okay, and most large-scale Scrum adoption probably are more painful than what you expect, considering the amount of change you need and considering the amount of buy-in that you need. And we'll probably talk about some of those things in the upcoming slide. Okay, so this is the less complete picture, and at the heart of less are the less principles, and beyond that is the less framework. And today our focus is on the less principles and the less framework. There are also guides. Guides are not really rules, and they are probably something. Try it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, no worries. And then there are 600 or 650 plus experiments through which you can actually evolve your process by yourself. Okay. Michael James, how many of you know Michael James? Okay. Michael James is one of the Scrum trainers, respected by the Scrum trainers. He's the author of the Scrum Master Checklist. Anyone familiar with the Scrum Master Checklist? Scrum Master Checklist, great place for new Scrum Masters. This is a short video by Michael James on how he's explaining the large-scale Scrum picture. Let's see if we can get the video played.
Here's a quick glance at the less complete picture. First, we'll look at 10 principles at the heart of less. These principles were learned empirically, meaning through experiments. Back in 2005, Craig Larman and Buswater started experimenting with Agile practices on large products. They documented 500 Agile experiments in their first 2 scaling books, then spent a few years distilling their continued experience down to these principles. Let's touch on more with less. We get more responsible teams when we resist the urge to carve out so many distinct roles. It's often tempting to create more specialized roles like architect, release train engineer, many variations of middle managers, various types of czars. But giving fixed responsibilities to named roles takes them away from the team. Scrum and less reduce the number of roles instead. Less segregation means more team self-management and ultimately a simpler, flexible organization. We're better able to collaborate with each other and the customer with fewer artifacts, handoffs, and fancy tools in the way. We want working products that meet the customer's needs, not intermediate inventory. There's more learning and fun when there's less burdensome process. Big companies tend to turn these knobs the wrong way, unless we are quite explicit that an adaptable organization is not designed the way yours is right now. There are several ways to learn about the other principles at the heart of less. A less framework is barely sufficient to kickstart empirical process control and whole product focus. Just like Scrum and Chess, less includes a minimal set of simple rules to avoid excess process. The basic less framework is for 2 through about 8 teams of 50 people, and less huge is for 8 or more teams, sometimes thousands of people on enormous products. All less teams try to develop one integrated shippable product every sprint. Large-scale Scrum is Scrum, not Scrum underneath layers of conventional management. Again, a less framework is barely sufficient to kickstart empirical process control and whole product focus. Teams focus on the actual customer. True agility is a difficult path for most companies, so the third book introduces guides. Guides are strong recommendations and tips that are almost always useful but aren't rules. Example guide topics are how to get started when you've got less than 8 teams versus when you've got more than 8 teams, what kinds of setbacks you can expect, specifically how to do multi-team backlog refinement, how to split requirements that seem too big for one sprint, how to stay sane. Less started with experiments in Scrum and Agility, eventually leading to everything else we've discussed. The first two books are quite thick and describe hundreds of experiments, some of which will be useful in your context and some which won't. The third book has guides, framework rules, and principles, so read that first. I'm MJ at the Seattle Scrum Company. I'm doing this because most of the companies I work with won't get the agility that Scrum promises without the fundamental organizational design changes in less.
I would recommend that you get this book. This is a little bit of a much easier read and probably gives you a little bit more tips on adoption and how to get started. And probably once you're done with this book, you can probably get the other two books as well. And I do not have any royalty coming to my bank account by advertising this book, but I'm just going to try and help you save some time. Okay. At the heart of LESS are the 10 LESS principles, and these 10 principles were empirically extracted based on Larman and Verge's experience, as well as other practitioners' experience. And one of the fundamental things is that large-scale Scrum is not new and improved Scrum. Large-scale Scrum is Scrum. And what large-scale Scrum does is it goes back to the roots of Scrum and identifies why Scrum works in the first place. And if we have multiple teams, how do we then make it work? So these are some of the trend principles in terms of which guide the large-scale Scrum framework itself. Okay, for example, very extensively used tool is a causal loop diagram, and this is coming from systems thinking. This diagram explains why, when there is a lot of pressure, engineers or developers produce crappy code, and it helps you model the system to understand the current reality, so that you can understand where are the defects or where are the organizational bugs or wastages, and then figure out how to solve some of those things. Because today I realized that Craig Larman, when teaching a class today, is using only causal loop diagrams to help people discover large-scale Scrum framework by themselves. Okay, so this tool is a very powerful tool if you are even using any if you are even getting familiar with some of these things, even for doing a retrospective at a larger scale to identify systemic impediments, this is probably a very good tool to have at your disposal. Another one is queuing theory, and I wanted to talk about this just a little bit because this is very unconventional, and our human brain is only capable of linear thinking, and queues behave in a non-linear fashion, and it is not inherently evident to many of us. And there's a small video to help you understand how queues work, and probably you have seen this before, and just help you recap. I play this video because queuing is such a very important process, especially when we're dealing with scaling, that we cannot intuitively guess how queuing works. And some of the very fundamental principles about queuing is incorporated into the large-scale Scrum, both Framework 1 and Framework 2. For example, we are not very obvious, or we are oblivious to existing queues. And in Scrum, we have two queues. Okay, what are those two queues? Anyone? Product backlog and sprint backlog. Yeah, product backlog and sprint backlog. And one of the fundamental principles in large-scale Scrum is to eliminate or abolish queues. And if you really cannot abolish queues, then reduce the number of queues, because queues add a complexity in a very different dimension. Okay? The fundamental problem you saw previously was a multi-queue, multi-server system, which is less efficient than a single queue, multi-server system. And if you want to go deep into queuing theory, you can probably get the first book, and Craig Larman kind of lays it out for you in quite a bit detail right there. Okay? Probably skip this slide, and we'll get into the basics of large-scale Scrum. You do have a handout in your tables. If you don't have a handout, Shams will be giving you the handouts. So based on these principles are abstract, they cannot be implemented in a concrete fashion. The frameworks are designed, or a kind of concrete implementation of the principles. So large-scale Scrum is Scrum, and there are 2 frameworks in large-scale Scrum for scaling. So let me explain you the basic framework, or LESS framework. And LESS is a little bit overloaded. I want you to know that. I mean, Craig is kind of an object-oriented guy, so he likes to overload stuff. And LESS by itself means we're talking about the complete LESS picture. And when we talk about LESS framework, this is what we mean by LESS framework. And I've intentionally added basic LESS to kind of make it a distinction at that point in time. So this smaller or basic LESS framework is applicable from 2 to 8 teams. 8 is not a magic number. It's something that's learned through experience. And you still follow the rules of Scrum. You have 1 product backlog. You have 1 product owner. All sprints mean you have only 1 sprint. And you have a sprint planning meeting during which the product owner and team representatives get together and identify what needs to be done. And then you have sprint planning meeting 2, in which the teams are figuring out how they are going to be building the product increment. During the sprint, the teams are responsible for coordination. The Scrum Master might serve 1 to 3 teams. There is no change in daily Scrum. Each team have their own daily Scrum, and each team is having their own sprint backlog. And the teams might do an individual product backlog refinement or a joint product backlog refinement. This big arrow that you see there is joint product backlog refinement. And the teams are coordinating amongst themselves to build 1 shippable product increment at the end of the sprint. So it's not 5 or 8 product increments. It's 1 cohesive shippable product increment at the end of the sprint. So you have 1 sprint review where you're having the product increment showcased to stakeholders. You're getting feedback from stakeholders. The feedback goes back into the product backlog. And then you have a team retrospective, or a team level retrospective, where the team is identifying improvement items for themselves. And then you have an overall retrospective where you have the product owner and team representatives coming in to identify systemic challenges to see how they can make the organization better. And the cycle repeats. So it's overloaded. This is the less huge framework. And if you have more than 8 teams, the same pattern, the basic LESS framework, gets replicated multiple times. And other than that, almost everything remains the same. Okay? It's still 1 product backlog, it's still 1 product owner, and it's still 1 product increment, and the basic framework gets replicated multiple times. Okay? Our focus today is going to be only on this, because 70-80% of scaling cases is covered with this basic framework. We will not be covering less huge, and if you want to learn more about less huge, you can go to less.works and learn a little bit more, and you can also get the book to learn a little bit more about less.works. Okay? So why do we have less rules? The less rules define the framework. And one of the most important things when multiple teams are scrumming together is coherence, cadence, and synchronization. Okay? You want to really see how multiple teams can scrum together, not each team doing their own scrum. Okay? That loses the purpose at that point in time. And so the less rules are non-mutable, and they are the minimum, bare minimum, that you need to get started with less, and it cannot change. Okay? You can follow the guide, you need not follow the guide. You can do the experiments, you don't need to do the experiments, but at minimum, you need to work with less rules. Okay? Questions? Yeah.
In that previous diagram, it wasn't clear to me what the teams are doing together and what the teams are doing apart.
During the sprint, the question is, what are the teams doing together? What are the teams doing apart? Short answer, during the sprint, they are building the product increment. And long answer, we're probably about 20 slides ahead of time at this point in time. So we'll get into some of those coordination things and meetings very soon. Okay? So let's talk about Scrum artifacts to get the basics right. One product backlog, multiple sprint backlog. It is not one sprint backlog. Each team will have their own sprint backlog, working together to build one product increment. One product backlog, and so you have one product owner. Now this has been a source of confusion for many people. If you have 5 teams, should you have 5 product owners or 1 product owner? And this is exactly what the Scrum Guide says about product backlog and product ownership. Multiple Scrum teams, when working together, still pull work from one product backlog, and one product owner is the sole person responsible for the backlog. This is exactly verbatim from the Scrum Guide. So we are not adding any extensions to Scrum to make Scrum scale. And again, product owner is one person, not a committee. So how does this work in reality? Okay? This is actually the common problem that I have seen, where people start focusing on having one product owner per team, and then they start locally optimizing stuff, and they lose the forest for the trees. Okay? And there's a common anti-pattern that I have seen when it comes to scaling, and many people don't recognize this as a Scrum Guide. So it's probably one of the important things about Scrum Guide. Now, why do we really need one product owner? Because it optimizes decision making. Okay? That's the whole point of having one product owner. Now, if you have only one product owner, how is the one product owner going to be working with multiple teams? Now, the basic principle is we want to have customer-centric focus, and we want to have a product owner who is focusing on the whole product. So it's going to be one product owner, but there are a couple of gotchas right there. Okay? When you have one product owner and when you have multiple teams, the product owner's focus changes from clarification to more of prioritization or ordering. So the team or the teams at this point in time are more responsible for clarification and more responsible for product backlog management activities, and the product owner then can start focusing on maximizing the value for the organization by ordering the product backlog in the right way. Again, this sentence, product owner may do product backlog refinement or have the development team do it, but the product owner ultimately remains accountable for the product backlog. This is again from the Scrum Guide. So less is nothing new, it's already there, and we are just kind of making it more pragmatic when implementing it in less. Okay? Couple of other gotchas for product ownership is that the product owner definitely makes sure that they are not going to be the bottleneck when it comes to communication, and essentially the product owner is responsible for ensuring that the team is having a positive, collaborative relationship with the stakeholders so that everything does not flow through the product owner. So that's some of the things that you need to watch out for. Please do not get the product owner involved into administrative area, as in do this, and start delegating more responsibilities to teams. Okay? So whatever the teams could do, they could probably do that. Okay? Now the question then becomes, who is the right product owner? Okay, if there is only one person who is going to be the product owner for multiple teams, what attributes should that particular product owner have? And let's answer this with gates. These are all gates at this point in time. And there are basically 3 different types of organization. If you are in a product development organization, or if you have a product development, if you have product marketing or product management, your product owner is from product marketing or from product management. Now, the earlier versions of the Scrum Guide was very, very clear in this, in stating that the product owner should be from product management. The later versions of the Scrum Guide somehow did not specify that very clearly for obvious reasons, intentionally incomplete, I guess. Okay, but less is not silent on this. If you're a product development firm, product marketing or product management, your product owner should be from product marketing or product management, and usually it's someone who has the power and authority to make decisions on the product itself, someone like a VP or an SVP of product management or product marketing. Okay, and obviously your teams are engineering teams at that point in time. The second use case is internal product development, and if you have internal product development, the lead user of the product or someone who is authorized by the sponsor of the projects, if you're doing projects, should be the product owner. It is not, the product owner is not from technology or IT. It's someone who knows the business and who can make decisions for the product from a business side of things. Okay? The third scenario is maybe a vendor-client partnership relationship at that point in time. You have a client, and then you have a vendor, and you have a receiving company. And in case you are employing a vendor, the product owner is usually from the client or the company who is actually paying for the services. Okay? These are 3 distinct scenarios, and the product owners are from, regardless of the scenario, the product owner is the person who has business acumen and who can make decisions on behalf of the product. Does it answer your question on product ownership?
Yes and no, because I understand the need when you're scaling like this. You have one product owner, so it cuts down on a lot of administrative work, making decisions on which direction teams work and go. But when it comes to actually working with the teams, one of the biggest bottlenecks in whole teams back is a lack of involvement of the product owner.
Thank you. I told you less adoption will be painful. We just identified one of the big pains.
So are you suggesting that for each team that they would have, don't use the word product owner, but a surrogate or are you suggesting there's another role, intermediate role?
No, I am not suggesting, we are not having any new roles in less other than the basic roles in Scrum. So what we are really saying is the team takes on more responsibility with regard to clarification and maybe splitting user stories or splitting product backlog item, maybe going to a user or maybe going to a stakeholder and getting some clarification. All those things is taken up by the team, and the product owner sets the vision, direction, and is responsible for the ordering of the product backlog to maximize value that the company can get out of the development. Yep.
But it's quite a bit for the product owner.
Yep, that's true. That's exactly the reason why the product owner needs to be the person who can make decisions on behalf of the product. And I'll tell you again, less adoption is probably going to be challenging. It's not easy. Okay, true less adoption is challenging. It's not easy. And I'll walk you through some of the steps of adoption later when we have time, so that you can get a better idea of what adoption looks like. Okay? Another question, yeah.
Is there any guidance in less for when product ownership, it needs to handle a larger scope than that? For where typically people will have a product manager versus product owner, not everything will fit into this size package.
So yes, for larger teams or?
For larger product work.
Okay, so I am deliberately skipping here one aspect of the guideline, which is defining the product. Okay. the definition of a product should be as broad as possible, and there are a few questions that you need to ask even before you get started to define the product. Thanks for asking the question. There are questions like, what is our customer buying? Okay, how does the customer use our product? Again, you can use the less principles in identifying and defining the product. So those are some of the questions that will broaden the definition of the product. And then you have, once you ask those broadening questions, you then need to ask the narrowing questions. What will the current organizational structure help us achieve? And what are the boundaries within our organization and outside our organization, and what is possible within this boundary and what is not possible within this boundary? So you need to ask those kind of expanding questions and then restricting questions to define your product. And once you define your product, obviously you can start sprinting. And the goal of management and Scrum Masters and the product owners is to keep expanding the definition of the product so that they can uncover organizational impediments. Okay. If you want more information, probably, let me see if I have this page, the browser window. Let me see if I can pull that up. I'll probably give you some links later on. It's right there. If you go to less.works, click on large scale Scrum and then click on product. It's right there. And that will help you kind of get some clarification on how do you define a product. In fact, it's probably one of the first things that you need to do before you even get started with less adoption. Okay. Second one is teams. Less explicitly calls out a few things that the Scrum guide is silent on. For example, Less says that each team should be a feature team. A feature team is a team that can take a customer-facing requirement and then they have all the technical skills needed to develop that particular product backlog item or requirement and start building the shippable product increment. Less is also explicit in calling out that the team should be co-located. Okay, you can have a team in Waltham, you can have a team in New York, you can have a team in India, but when you say someone belongs to a team, they should be sitting right next to each other. And these three teams, located in three different geographies, can still be working on the same product with one product owner, but they should be co-located. Less does not say, or Less is very explicit on this. So many of the adoptions that I'm seeing kind of fails here because they're not able to co-locate people, and that's again an organizational impediment, and that's something that you need to address even before you can start your Less adoption. Okay, each team is self-managing. Larman and Wood, I prefer to use the term self-managing because Richard Hackman has a very good definition of self-managing, and when it comes to self-organizing teams, there are no good definition of self-organizing teams. So you would see the term as self-managing in Less literature rather than as self-organizing, but they pretty much mean the same. Okay, and we try to maintain the teams together as long as possible. Okay. And this is a classic example of how feature teams start working. You have product backlog items, and the teams are pulling in product backlog items, but each of those items might touch upon multiple components because it's a cross-cutting product backlog item, a customer-facing or end-user-facing product backlog item. And so the team needs to coordinate amongst themselves when it comes to building the product increment. And Less does give a lot of guidelines on technical excellence. In fact, if you do not have technical excellence, if you do not have continuous integration, test-driven development, it'll probably be a very big struggle for you to get started with Less adoption. Okay, so going back, this is usually a current organizational structure. The organization is divided along components or functional areas where you have a manager for each of those functional areas, and they start working on their respective components, and you usually have a PMO or a project management office running around with various coordination activities to get the functions built. Okay? Very explicitly, you do not have a design sprint or testing sprint or requirement sprint or very specific any named sprint. So Scrum is not for them. Scrum is for building product increments. When you move to less, one of the guidelines is to use self-designing teams to organize into cross-functional feature teams. You get all the people from a specific product group into a room, have a mingle session, I help them identify each of their skills, and they select their own team members. And you can have a facilitator who will time box each of those sessions. And it probably takes a couple of iterations. And when I was working with one of the big banks in New York, we had about 120 people forming teams, and it took us about 30 to 35 minutes to form cross-functional feature teams. And we probably formed like about 15 or 18 teams at that point in time. 30, 35 minutes, it was almost cross-functional, and they were almost able to deliver end-to-end features. Okay? What is missing between these two pictures? What is missing between these two pictures in terms of what's existing in a regular waterfall organization and what is not existing when we are moving to feature teams? Managers. Okay, anything else?
No PMO.
PMOs. Okay, so PMOs don't exist unless, and the role of manager also changes. In fact, large-scale Scrum does not recommend projects. Large-scale Scrum does not recommend projects. The preferred way of approaching product development is start using products instead of projects. Define your product and start using the product. Okay? Questions? Questions? Yep.
The concern in looking at that chart is you've got the right number of experts to fit all those various teams. And I don't think that's reality.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering how you address that.
Yep. So if the team is not having all the required skills, they should be willing to learn new skills. That includes technical as well as domain skills. So the team members are multi-learners. So we talk not just about T-shaped development team members, we talk about team members who are skilled, not just from a technical side of things, but also from a product side of things, or rather start learning about the product itself. Make sense? Yeah. Question?
So does, in your experience, does less provide sufficient transparency that if you have a situation where the people involved are not sufficiently broadly skilled yet, and perhaps they're very resistant to breaking down some of their component focus, does it provide enough transparency that you could safely allow the teams to organize in a less helpful way and then use the retrospective process so that they can see that they want to move towards cross-functionality?
Short answer, yes. Feature team adoption map is a less gated feature team adoption map, which kind of gives you a roadmap of how the teams can grow. And there is a second tool, which is your definition of done. Your definition of done will also help you understand what is currently possible given the constraints, and then you can expand your definition of done over the period of time. Okay, Rick, you have a question?
Are you going to talk about technical debt?
We're going to be talking about technical debt. Possibly no, because it is just like Scrum, it only kind of makes things that are challenging more visible. The challenge is that what do managers do? What do line managers do? And in many of the less adoptions, the biggest source of resistance has been line managers and functional managers, because less is again silent, just like Scrum, on what happens to project managers. line managers, and functional managers. But Les does call out the lean principle, job safety and salary safety, but no role safety. So when people use less to eliminate employees from the organization, it creates a fear mentality, and most likely the adoption will fail at that point in time. Now, what exactly does management do? There are quite a few things that managers can do. Good managers know how to add value, and less does provide guidelines to management in terms of what they should be doing, but they cannot expect to keep doing the same thing that they were doing before the transition. Okay? So definitely if you provide job safety and salary safety, people will get innovative in how they can define value for the organization. Practical example, same bank that I was talking about, when we redesigned the organization, the functional managers volunteered to become part of team members, development team, because they said that, okay, we have been promoted to manager only because we were really very good at it, but we really enjoy hands-on coding. And so we want to really be part of the development team. Their external title remained the same. Their job, their internal title did change, and the salary did not change as well. And it kind of addresses some of those questions about how do you really go about some adoption. The challenge really comes if you're a vendor company or a third-party company developing software for someone else, because a lot of the overhead in a vendor company or services company is management, because they are managing people. And if you really do a transition at that point in time, it becomes a little bit more challenging from my experience. Okay? The third role is Scrum Master. And a Scrum Master can serve 1 to 3 teams. 3 is the upper limit. And if the Scrum Master is serving 3 teams, probably they are building the same product. It's not 3 different products. And one of the emphasis called out here about Scrum Master is that the focus of Scrum Master changes over a period of time. Okay? A lot of time people think that Scrum Master is not a full-time job because Scrum Master is heavily involved, especially when rolling out Scrum. And Les kind of makes it explicit that Scrum Master is a full-time job, and that the focus of the Scrum Master changes from teams and product owners in the initial adoption time to more of looking at the organization and to help development teams incorporate good engineering practices. You do see a small blip right there in the top for organization, and that is because when you initially adopt less, the Scrum Master is helping the organization in the whole redesign itself. And that's one of the reasons why they are focusing on product owner, team, and the organization initially. And once less structure is in place, they start focusing more on product owners and teams. Okay. Questions on Scrum roles? It's a quick Scrum Master survival guide. It's going to be a long journey. It's not going to be easy. And focus on what is possible. Okay. Any questions on 3 roles? So Les is not introducing any new roles when it comes to Scrum. We are still sticking with the basics: product owner, Scrum Master, team. Any questions on Scrum roles? Okay, let's look at Scrum meetings. We have only one sprint, and that sprint is synchronized between teams. We have only one sprint. The sprint is synchronized between the teams, and the teams start at the same time and end at the same time. Okay. Let's talk about sprint planning. Sprint planning is the first meeting that occurs in the beginning of the sprint. Scrum Guide calls out that 2 topics should be discussed during sprint planning, and less explicitly calls out to separate them, especially in a multi-team context. You have sprint planning 1, where the product owner and the team representatives discuss what should be done, and probably they are crafting the sprint goal at that point of time. And once that happens, the team representatives go back to the teams. The teams might do their own sprint planning 2. Sprint planning 2 or sprint planning topic 2 is how do we really build the product increment, and that's where you're talking about what are the technical, non-technical, and administrative tasks that need to be done by the team to build the product increment. So the teams might, if they don't have any dependencies, might actually have their own sprint planning meeting too, But if the teams are working on shared components, they may sit together and work on a joint design session during the sprint planning topic 2. And then during that sprint planning 2 meeting, they might segregate tasks between the teams at that point of time. So this is very common if a feature cuts across multiple components and there is a second feature by a second team volunteered, and it's also cutting across multiple components. So a joint design session and a joint planning is very, very helpful at that point of time. Summary. Okay, so here's some of the tips about sprint planning itself, and this is probably general Scrum tips. If your sprint planning 1 is too long, even if you're doing single team Scrum, you're probably not doing product backlog refinement very diligently. And if there are too many dependencies between teams, then probably they are not very cross-functional. So these are some of the things that you need to watch out for during sprint planning as your teams are scrumming together. Okay? Some guidelines on sprint planning topic 2. Usually a larger room is much more efficient, and usually if all the teams are in the same location, if they can get together in a larger room, that's much more effective too, because planning can be much easier. Usually the product owner is also available for any clarifications if needed at that point of time. When the teams are running into any challenges, then probably the product owner can clarify things for multiple teams at that point in time. Okay? Daily Scrum is no different than single team Scrum, and one additional idea is that you can have observers of one team in another team's daily Scrum to observe what's happening in the team and then to come back with information that might be helpful to their respective team. Okay? The biggest challenge is coordination during the sprint, and Les provides a lot of guidelines for coordination. The number one thing is just talk, as in pick up the phone or just walk to the other person and talk. And a lot of people look at, we need Scrum of Scrum for coordination, or we need some other meeting for coordination, and Les explicitly calls out some of the decentralized coordination techniques, and the decentralized coordination techniques are preferred over centralized coordination techniques like Scrum of Scrum. Okay? Another one is communicate in code. If two people or two teams are checking into the code base at the same time, probably they know it if they are getting the latest version from the version control, and then they probably can start working with each other to identify if they are working with the same component as well. It's another technique for coordination, especially when multiple teams are working on the same component. Okay? We talked about this, observers to other teams' daily Scrum. Couple of other guidelines on coordination is avoid branching. Okay? You do not create one branch per team or one branch per feature. You're probably developing on trunk or mainline. And if you're probably developing on trunk or mainline, you really need to have excellent technical practices so that your mainline or trunk is clean all the time. And that's exactly where extreme programming technical practices and guidelines from Les comes into picture. Okay? You also have communities and community mentors who can be guiding the teams when it comes to designing shared components and stuff. Okay, Joel, you have a question? Okay.
So, in the reality where most people are coming from, this is a pretty far stretch from where they're starting. What is Les's guidance for, okay, great, we know we need to get there to execute in that way, but we're starting from a place where no CI, no ability to do any of this, separate branches.
Yeah. So I'll get there, Joel. You're 3 slides ahead. Let me address that when you talk about definition of done. Okay. Les explicitly calls out that avoid Scrum of Scrums, because Scrum of Scrums is a centralized coordination technique, and centralized coordination techniques are not preferred, and decentralized coordination techniques are preferred. But if Scrum of Scrum works for you, just continue it. There are no false dichotomies. There is no right or wrong answer. If it works for you, it works for you. Okay, continue working. Okay. Last slide on product backlog refinement. Just like sprint planning, there are 2 parts to it. where an overall product backlog refinement happens, where the product owner is providing some clarification and guidelines and ordering the backlog. And then the teams can then do a joint product backlog refinement or a multi-team product backlog refinement if they may be working on similar components in the future, and if they know that they might be tentatively the team that might be pulling up that particular product backlog item. Or if a team is pretty sure that they are the only team that's going to be working on a product backlog item and they don't have any other dependencies or overlapping components, then that one specific team can do their own product backlog refinements. Okay. Sprint review, again, one sprint review, okay, especially when you're having multiple teams, it is suggested that you use diverge merge techniques so that you have larger meetings. Initially, you might set up a sprint bazaar where multiple teams are showing what they built to stakeholders, and then you might have a converge session where the product owner is sharing some updates and getting feedback and then incorporating that feedback back into the product backlog. Okay. Retrospective has two parts to it. At the team level, the teams are identifying improvement items for their particular team behavior and how they work. And after the team retrospective, there is an overall retrospective where the Scrum Master, the product owner, managers, if you have managers, and team representatives identify systemic impediments which come in the way of product development and then start resolving some of those things as well. Okay? The time boxes for the meetings follow the same guidelines as the time boxes for the Scrum framework. So retrospective in Scrum is 3 hours for a 4-week long sprint and is usually shorter for a shorter sprint. So the same guidelines apply here as well. Okay? The same guidelines are for sprint planning and daily Scrum as well, and for product backlog refinement as well. Okay? This is another important topic. Probably I'll cover this as well because Joel asked this question. We have one product. We have one product owner. How would you really work with definition of done? Okay? There is one definition of done for the product because we are building one product increment. The teams might extend their base definition of done and have additional items added to their respective team's definition of done, but ultimately the product increment should be done as per the definition of done, such that it is shippable at the end of every single sprint. Now, the most challenging place, especially when it comes to scaling using less, is getting to a perfect definition of done. The organization, so to answer Joel's question, how do you really avoid some of those things? And how do you really get started, especially when you have a lot of technical debt and stuff like that, is usually there's a period where an organization buys into less and then the adoption actually starts rolling out. And the recommendation is, usually it's 2 months, 3 months, depending on the nature of the organization. And if you can get to a perfect definition of done at that point in time, get to a perfect definition of done even before you start your first sprint. So for example, your perfect definition of done might include automated unit tests, automated integration tests, automated regression tests, automated performance tests. Okay? And if you can get there, if you have enough time. But if you cannot, your definition of done is a little bit imperfect at that point of time, and then you would gradually work towards making your definition of done perfect. And here is a concept called as undone work introduced. If you have a perfect definition of done, and if all your product backlog items are completed as per your perfect definition of done, your product is shippable at the end of the sprint. But if you have an imperfect definition of done, then there is something called as undone work. Let me explain you what undone work means. For example, your organizational design and technical capabilities might be structured in such a way that today you can do unit testing, integration testing, but you cannot do automated performance testing because you're dependent on a vendor and you do not have the infrastructure to do automated performance testing. So your current definition of done might include unit testing, integration testing, and manual performance testing, And then there will be some undone work because you cannot really do manual performance testing every single sprint. And then that undone work is the manual performance testing not done during sprint 1, and it increases during sprint 2, and it increases during sprint 3. And your goal is to get to a perfect definition of done, and you deal with the undone work either by having a separate sprint or really figuring out how do you really handle undone work at that point in time. Okay? Les also talks about, gives guidelines on organizational structure. I'm not going to go detail into this. Also gives guidelines for management and technical practices. Okay? And some guidelines on adoption as well. Okay? I'm not going to go over these slides, but I'll make these slides available to you. But definitely if you want to get started, this is the feature team adoption map that I was talking about. Someone was asking a question on that. How do we really get to perfection? You know, that's the thing. And if you want to get started, these are some of the guidelines for getting started. Have a less education program so that people understand why they are doing something like this. And then define the product. So look at the expanding definition and constricting definitions. And then define your current definition of done and explicitly identify the undone work. And then have cross-functional feature teams. And then ensure that only the product owners give work and keep the managers away from the teams and keep the managers away from giving work to teams. Okay? So with this, I would conclude this presentation. Any open questions at this point in time? Go.
The question I have is on system tests, because normally a system test is for the product that you want to ship in that sprint. Now you have multiple teams contributing to the creation of that done. Now, how is the system test team organized, and how is it integrated into the organization you mentioned?
You do not have a separate system test team. Okay. That's actually one of the pre-less adoption or component teams or functional teams. And when you do a transformation, when you do a team self-design, the system team is dissolved. Okay. And system testing team members become part of functional cross-feature teams.
But you still have to do the system test.
You still have to do the system test. Look at this. So performance testing. So this might be your current definition of done, and you're looking at improving your definition of done over the period of time. So you will still have some undone work here, which needs to be completed before you can release the product. Okay, but perfection vision is the ideal goal. It's one of the LESS principles. So over the period of time, you're trying to expand your current definition of done. So it may be a 2-year goal, it might be a 5-year goal, but you're not able to do it currently, and you recognize it as undone work, but you're looking at expanding your current definition of done, add some capabilities, skills, get some servers, hardware necessary, software licenses necessary, so that you can start working on some of these things. And these might be the things that might be discussed during an retrospective.
Can I clarify that a little bit? So the actual system, automated system testing that need to be incorporated before it's done, then falls on as a responsibility of each individual Scrum team. So how you would look at it?
So here's the general recommendation. If you can get to a perfect definition of done, if you can address it before you can get started, do that. If not, identify that explicitly as undone work, and that it's actually not creating transparency to the product owner and the organization. And then when the product needs to be released, just complete the undone work at that point in time and then release it. Okay. So the test that needs to be done for your respective product, that's very specific to your product. So look at all the things that needs to be done. So when you're crafting your definition of done, look at all the things that needs to be done, and then that is your perfect definition of done. So validation test, system test, hardware, software, all those things. But your current capabilities and organizational structure do not give you the leverage to do it within a sprint because of lack of skills, lack of hardware, lack of licenses, whatever it is. So explicitly recognize that work as undone work, and then address it and create transparency to the product owner by calling that we have not done validation test, but if we need to release the product, we need to do the validation test before we can release the product. But more importantly, we are looking at how we can expand our definition of done so that we can include validation test as part of our definition of done during the sprint. Make sense? Yeah. So the question is, you said that teams should be co-located, but in reality, teams are not co-located. So let me clarify what I mean by co-location. If Tom, David, Peter belong to a team, and if they're all sitting in Waltham, they are a co-located team. If Tom is in Waltham, David is in New York, and Peter is in India, that's not a co-located team. In fact, that's probably not even a team. It's a pseudo team at that point in time. It's actually a dislocated team. Okay, it's not a distributed team. It's a dislocated team. Now, I can have a co-located team, Tom, David, and Peter sitting here in Waltham. Okay, I can have Shyam, Meena, and David there sitting in India, and that's okay. That is a distributed teams. So one of the adoption thing is you do need management buy-in and bottom-up and top-down buy-in, and you have to address some of these things with your top-down buy-in at that point in time. So in a larger organizational context, it might mean that people move from one business unit to a different business unit, and how it works out, Les does not give you any guidelines, but that's the way I have seen it in practice. Okay? Okay, question?
With respect to the undone work, there's typically stuff that goes into the definition of done for a story, and then there's more stuff that has to be done before the thing can be released. So integration testing, trained customer support, things like that. That would be considered undone work?
So there is a cost of undone work. The definition of done is cross-cutting across most product backlog item. Acceptance criteria go into the user story, and the definition of done is cross-cutting. So there is a distinction between acceptance criteria and definition of done. So for example, an undone work might be creating marketing materials. Let me give you a solid example. I was working with a L&D, learning and development company. We were actually building a product for learning management systems and LMS. And one of the things that we need to do is to train the customer service representatives on how to attend phone calls from professors and universities when we are rolling out the product, and we have to create help manuals. Now, we explicitly identified that as part of undone work because we had a separate contractor who was actually creating the help manuals and was preparing the marketing materials. And as part of the rollout of the LMS, the customer service representative needed some training into the new version of the product. We explicitly identified that as undone work, but other than that, we had transparency into the product increment itself, meaning with a push of a button, we could deploy it into the web servers, and they could start using it, and the customer service reps then would struggle, and they would not have help manuals, but we wanted to avoid that situation. So whenever the product owner said, okay, we are going to launch this product in summer when the universities are closed, when professors are not working, then we would address the undone work. We'd have a training session for the customer service representatives. We would get the contractor to build the help manuals at that point in time, and then complete the undone work and then release it. So over the course of time, so for example, this is with a little bit of a smaller system. Over the course of time, if you have a larger system, your definition of done does expand. For example, if you are working with FDA and you have independent verification and validation, that would explicitly be undone work because the cost of having IV&V every single sprint is pretty high. But what you need to recognize is that, okay, we are explicitly identifying this as undone work, and then we need to complete this to actually have the product in a releasable state. For example, you're preparing legal brochures or marketing brochures. No? At that point of time, you might explicitly identify. So there is transparency that Les creates by explicitly identifying the undone work. Okay? Cool.
The last question.
Last question. Okay. Last question.
Maybe I'll make that too.
Okay.
You had an example earlier on self-forming teams. Do those teams reform after a deliverable in your experience? And then if you have time, does DevOps and less, what's your experience on that?
So it's totally compatible. I mean, if I can actually bring in a browser, it will be much helpful if you can go to less.works. Yes, some of the technical practices that we are talking about today from a less perspective, the DevOps builds on top of that, so it's totally compatible with DevOps, so it's nothing different at that point in time. Self-designing teams, once the teams are formed, we keep the teams together as long as possible because long-standing teams have tacit knowledge, they know how to work together. So all the work comes through the teams, through the product backlog, so there is no need to reshuffle the teams all the time. Okay? So there's quite a bit of information on less.works, and you can go there. Chapter 2 of the 3rd book is available for free. You can read that and get a good introduction as well. Okay? And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And Shyam and Agile New England, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to sit here.
Thank you.